Morning and welcome everyone to this week's Inside APSAD webinar. My name's James Hoey, one of the educators here with Insight. And before we begin, and I get to introduce our very generous host today, who's come up, presenter today, who's come along, I'd like to begin our time together this morning by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands. So here in Miagin, or otherwise known as Brisbane, we're on the lands of the Turrbal and the Yuggera people, and to pay my respects to elders who have passed on and also those who are leading today. And I also would like to acknowledge the traditional owners upon all the lands that we're meeting from in webinar land today. So welcome again to this week's presentation. For those of you who might have tuned in last week or who have observed our calendar of webinars for this semester, we're having a little bit of a focus on motivational interviewing and some of the ways that it can be applied and integrated in our practice around working with people impacted by substance use concerns and issues, as well as also those who are their loved ones and around them. So this is the second in that series, and I'd like to just acknowledge this morning Mark Powell, who's joining us from Warrnambool, which if you're not too familiar with your Australian geography, is on the southwestern coast of Victoria. So down there, just where the Great Ocean Road ends, I think, Mark, is where that is. But you can tell us a little bit more about that. And Mark, I actually met Mark earlier this year in Melbourne when we both attended the Motivational Interviewing Network of Trainers Oceania chapter forum, which was an amazing day, 2 days spent with some very good humans, of which I count Mark as part of that, with a lot of people really generously sharing their practice and their resources around how they have adapted and used MI in their practice. And I was privileged to hear Mark speak on the topic that he's presenting on today. And it really kind of resonated as something that I think will be very helpful, particularly for those who are working in family responsive ways out there in all of the different services that are represented. So Mark is a mental health nurse and the current Chief Executive Officer of WRAD Health. And I'll let Mark talk to you a little bit about that service and what they do. And before I hand over to him, though, just to let you know that with our webinar today, there is the opportunity to post any questions or comments into the chat as we go through. And that chat will be seen by the host and the panelists. It doesn't necessarily show up to everybody, but just rest assured that it will come through to us. We'll collate those questions then, or anything kind of any comments that are relevant, and we'll have a time for question and answer with Mark at the end before our time is finished this morning. So without any further ado, it is my privilege this morning to hand over to you, Mark. So thank you again for being here.
Oh, thanks, James. Hopefully audio is working okay. Really welcome this opportunity to talk about some of the work we've been doing down in southwest Victoria around engaging families in conversations using a motivational interviewing framework. My background, as James said, is as a mental health nurse, but I've worked across the sectors of alcohol and other drugs and mental health for a number of years, and I've really found motivational interviewing to be an absolute mainstay of my practice. And more recent years, because I've done a lot more with families over that time and really appreciated the work with families, started to share the skills of MI to families in how to have better conversations with their loved ones. So just a little bit about the service, just for context, I guess. WRAD Health, we're a bulk billing medical practice with a co-located alcohol and other drug service and mental health support services in that program. We started out as an alcohol and other drug service and moved into more that general health, and really holistic care is kind of our mission for the southwest region of Victoria. And I come to you on the lands of if the PowerPoint works. the lands of the Peek Wurrung peoples of the Gunditjmara Maar nations, and pay my respects to the elders past and present, and also acknowledge Eastern Maar as the traditional owners of the area that we're on. And I haven't got it in this slide, but I always like to put in a plug for right over to the west of border there is a Hayward, and in Hayward there's a Butcherbim Reserve, which is a World Heritage listed reserve of Aboriginal heritage, and we have in there remnants of stone huts that date back to about 6,000 years, which is pretty incredible sort of level of history. But we've also got midden sites in the dunes that date back to over 70,000 years. So it's a really rich cultural history for our area. And I think it's just worth, as land and culture are so important to Aboriginal communities, I think the purpose of this talk is really about family connections and its importance towards recovery. Also, just like to acknowledge the lives of the lived and living experience workforce and the people with mental health and substance use issues, and as well as their carers, and recognise their strength, courage, and unique perspective as a vital contribution to our service to learn and grow and achieve better outcomes. I think what I've learned is a lot from families over that journey, and so I really just want to acknowledge their commitment and their strength in this journey as well. And just really quickly, we were part of a project we did a couple of years ago now with lived and living experience people in terms of writing their own stories. And part of that journey was to come up with an animation of a message that they would like to convey to anyone who may be experiencing and struggling with substance use disorder. Some key things that they thought were really key messages to get across to help instill hope, but also acknowledging where they're at. So I'll just play that. It's only 90 seconds, and if sound doesn't work, don't worry, because it is predominantly an animation. As you can see, it's a pretty powerful little animation that covers so many key elements of people that may be experiencing addiction and the importance of connection. And that's why this presentation to me is so important about connecting with families and bringing families into the treatment realm rather than excluding them. So what does motivational interviewing, MI, have to do with parenting teens and young adults? As our children grow, the stakes of their decisions grow, and they become a little bit more scary in some of the choices that they make. And I guess as parents, our natural reaction is to want to try and control that behaviour. As I often talk about in our groups, that control pretty early dissipates, when a child's having a tantrum, or, you start to realise the limitations of parents' control. But yeah, when we do try and take control, it often leads to conflict and resentment, and further alienates the person that you're most trying to help. And I guess one of the things that motivational interviewing and Milo, motivational interviewing for loved ones, really has adapted some of those core elements of motivational interviewing skills to help families navigate this journey in a more helpful and constructive way. Yeah, all right, I'll move on. I'm more used to interactive kind of presentations, so doing these asynchronous ones are kind of where there's not exchange is always a little bit different for me. One of the things that we say at the start of our groups, I've been running family and friends groups now for a number of years. We always like to remind families of the 6 Cs, and I don't know whether people have heard of these before. The first one is you can't control it as much as you would like to take control of the situation. Control is sometimes part of the problem. You can't cure it for your loved one, so we need to work with them and be part of their journey. And you didn't cause it. So often families come to our sessions with a sense of guilt and shame and sometimes self-blame, thinking, what have I done to do this? And we really like to remind family members that they're just one part of that journey, one part of that person's life. They're not the whole part of it, because if they were able to have complete control, they wouldn't be here. So, just reminding them about that, and that there are things that they can do that are really more helpful for them. So taking care of themselves, they can make healthy choices, and they can learn to communicate better. And that's what we try and do in these groups, is really empower families with different ways to approach these difficult kind of conversations that often, in that traditional writing reflex kind of way, where they just jump to a lecturing or telling them what to do, to modifying the way they approach these really difficult conversations that they have with a loved one who's engaging in behaviours that are really risky. And that's the other side of this. There's some really serious risk at play here, and that you can understand families' level of distress when faced with that. So, why, as a loved one, what you don't want to hear, and this applies from community as much as from your loved one themselves. I guess families often hear these kind of messages through media, through film. You need to let them hit rock bottom, and it's such an abstract concept. What is a rock bottom? And the levels of rock bottom that I see. Just recently had a family member come in whose young loved one had been heavily abusing alcohol to the point where they had an admission for a Wernicke's encephalopathy. 3 months later, they were out of hospital, continued drinking, ended up back in hospital, and now have got significant peripheral neuropathy. So to what she described as the way she walks now is a bit like she's got cerebral palsy. Really significant. What's rock bottom when you talk about that? That's just not a helpful concept for families to have. And I guess it also implies a level of passivity, that there's nothing I can do, so I've just got to step back and let nature take its course. And the evidence is really saying that there's a lot families can do, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. The label of enabling them, I think, much like labeling someone as an addict or an alcoholic, it's really unhelpful. It diminishes the person to one thing, and it really is quite confusing messages for families. So we had the conversation in our group last night with a mum. So, well, should I really help try and get my son to school? Is that enabling? And we're kind of saying, well, that's not really enabling, as I would understand it. That's about helping a person in their journey of recovery, if that's something they want to do, rather than. So families get very uncertain about what is enabling and what's not. And so we just think it's better to move away from those kind of labels to being really constructive. And this other concept that you're just not being tough enough. And the very nature of addiction, as I'm sure all of you that are listening here know, that one of the definitions of addiction is continued use despite adverse consequence or harm. So applying more punishment with a view that that's going to make people change seldom is a real motivator for change. So really, again, we just really try to move away from those unhelpful kind of things that families hear. And also, from their loved one that they're caring for, some of the things that they don't like to hear there is when they're not seeing it as a problem, or they don't care, that kind of blame that families sometimes experience. Loved ones sometimes do blame and unfairly, that it's your fault. And as I said before, that's why we like to remind people about that you cannot be the sole cause of anyone's behaviour, and recognising what's in your control and what's outside of your control. And as you can understand, those kind of responses can really feel hurtful and dismissive, and leave families in a state of fear or frustration or desperation. And we often see in that is when that righting reflex or that urge to try and fix it jumps in. We've got kind of well, I don't know whether it's a funny anecdote, but one of our family's been coming to groups for quite a few years, and they've coined the phrase "the fix-it shop's shut." And they actually went and bought a sign off Temu or somewhere like that that has their name on it, and it just says "Fix-it shop is closed," which is just reminding them that we've got to resist that urge to jump in and try and fix these situations and actually slow down and just connect with our loved one. Because when you get into that fixing kind of mode, it often is an opportunity to once again incur a lot of blame and judgment from your loved ones. So really trying to move away from that. And how this kind of all relates to motivational interviewing, I think it teaches us how to slow down, how to connect. Maybe think a little bit more about what we are saying and doing that might be making it harder for the kind of conversations we want to hear. So, when you're pushing for change, a person, as you would know with motivational interviewing, when we're pushing for change or arguing for change, what we're creating is a space for our loved one to resist that and to argue against change. So we're kind of getting into that really unhelpful dynamic where they're generating more arguments to stay the same rather than arguments to change. And not that we ever recommend to families to take the complete opposite, but it's kind of understanding that whilst we're in that space of arguing for change, there's no space left for them to be contemplating change. They're left in a space of having to argue to stay the same. So we really try and teach families to learn to listen without judgment, understand judgment's a natural part of it, but maybe not to react to that. Try and create sort of safer conversations and really tune in. So there's a lot we talk about listening for change talk, the darn cat, to really start to listen for those kind of desires, ability, reasons, need, kind of language from a person and to tune into that and just to create space for that to be more of the conversation, not, for a loved one the other day was talking about, I think I need to do something about it, my drinking or drugs, I can't remember what it was now. And the urge then is to take that person into an alcohol and other drug centre and get treatment started, that kind of thing. And what she did really well was to just pause and just be curious about why do you think that? Tell me a bit more about that. So it just invited more of a conversation around what this person was thinking as a need for change, which is just fantastic. It's exactly, but not easy to do. As I say, as parents and partners, we're kind of in that space of really wanting to help because we see pain. We see a person struggling and we kind of want to fix it. So it's a very understandable reaction that we have, just not necessarily helpful. So teaching people to just be more reflective. So, just acknowledging that a person might be feeling that kind of pain now. So motivational interviewing, I think, gives us those tools to turn hard conversations into more helpful and hopeful ones, and helps you to hear more of what you would like to hear as a parent too. And yeah, all right. Why families matter, and there's a fair bit. As I say, my background has been in both mental health and drug and alcohol, and I guess I was blessed in the early days of deinstitutionalisation when we moved out into the community to have to see people in their homes and start to see the bigger picture of the lives that they live with and the people they live with, and to develop the skills and confidence, because it takes a bit of confidence, I guess, to want to engage with families in that journey. But I always view family members as being part of the treatment team, and you've probably heard it many a time before, but, they are the other 23 hours of the day or with that person. So it just makes sense to engage them, to teach them a little bit about what they can do and to help their involvement. So we know that there's good evidence for involvement of families in improving outcomes. So in terms of things like substance use, there's been compared against individual therapy alone, there's been seen impact in improving the effects lasting up to 18 months post-treatment. And it kind of makes sense that if you've got a person who's undertaking behaviour change, families are learning about all of that stuff. They're learning about the skills and techniques that might help support a person. They also may be learning about some of the things that they do that are unhelpful as well, so they can think about their own change in that journey as well. And so it leads to a less stressful household and a more helpful environment. We know family therapy is significantly improves treatment retention and adherence and recovery outcomes. And whilst this is not family therapy as such, just reinforces the value of engaging families and giving them skills that are evidence-based that may help in this journey. Yeah, so some studies report family involvement increases treatment retention by up to 50%. Family-based therapy reduces relapse rates by 25% compared to individual therapy. And the other big one for me is families often feel excluded or blamed. And I've been working with families for a number of years now, and it is a pretty common experience, the frustration of getting access to good information about their loved one, what's going on for them. And there are those challenges that I guess we as a sector have around confidentiality and how we work with families. And certainly in Victoria, a lot's been done in that space to recognise the role of carers within the Mental Health Act, and I think that's certainly the right direction to be going. But we also need to be sensitive that they're not always the most helpful, and understanding a little bit more about those dynamics. There's, as I say, they're despite being a really highly effective resource, they're quite often underutilized. And as I said before, we're not giving them the skills of how to engage either and work. And I kind of think motivational interviewing has just been a wonderful tool for me in the kind of conversations I have with people. So it kind of makes sense to teach that to families to help them with those kind of conversations. And we do hear that feedback over the journey is not only do they have less confrontational and less highly emotionally charged conversations with their loved ones, but they can also use those kind of conversations in other settings as well, which is really helpful, I think. Um, so, and we need to move away from that kind of attitude that families are part of the problem, you know. And if they are part of the problem, they need to be part of the solution. So we really need to be engaging them in that journey. I like the language in motivational interviewing that it's an invitation, it's not a prescription. So you're just inviting people to think about these things differently and to maybe explore trying different strategies. Really important to remind people that this is not a easy thing to learn. It is a thing about practice. It is a thing about having patience. We had one family member talk about, well, this was her hesitancy about trying to have different conversations. Oh, my daughter will just say I'm pretending to be a therapist and going to be really annoyed with that. What do I say? And I said, well, acknowledge that you're trying something different. Acknowledge that you really care about our relationship and that this is hard. And I'm kind of hearing about this stuff and I understand it to be, good evidence to support it. And I just want to try it. Is that okay with you? So, just letting them know, just acknowledging that. One of the things I guess early on in my journey that I found really helpful, and I don't know if anyone's ever heard the title of the book, How to Get Your Loved Ones Sober, an alternative to nagging, pleading, or threatening. When I say that title to family members, they all have a smile because they kind of relate that I have definitely nagged, I've definitely pleaded, and I've definitely threatened to try and help my loved one. And we just remind people that that comes from a really good place. You care. That's why you're doing it. It's just maybe not the most helpful. So Dr. Robert Myers was part of the CRAFT, if anyone's ever heard of that study, Community Reinforcement Approach and Family Training. And that was a good evidence-based approach that combined these skills. And it found that success rates of around 70% of people were getting into treatment by just changing the way the families were working with their loved one. So giving them these skills and knowledge is a really helpful strategy that invites people to consider change instead of trying to force them to change. And the reality is just by getting into treatment doesn't mean, unfortunately, that people will stay in treatment. So there's a lot that has to happen at the treatment end as well. Again, which is why we really like to engage with families, because my experience, often families are the ones that are ready for treatment. They want something to change sooner than their loved one. And if we talk to them about stages of change model, explain where their loved one might be sitting and where they're sitting in that continuum, and try and bring them both together a little bit more, it just creates greater collaboration. And so if we think about the spirit of motivational interviewing, you know, partnership, compassion, evocation, or empowerment and acceptance. So really talk to families about the spirit, because the spirit really underpins everything we're doing with motivational interviewing, and people are recognizing when they're walking alongside rather than in front or behind. So in front is kind of implying being that very directive, and there may be times when you need to be. There may be really high risk stuff that you kind of need to be directive and understand that, well, I'm not doing motivational interviewing right now. I'm actually really doing some first aid, if you like. There are times when we sort of, uh, really want to be more in that guiding space. And there's times when we're just following, being really passive. And we just want families to recognize where they're at and to have greater self-awareness and maybe just think about what they're doing in that space. Compassion is really kind of seeing their pain, not judging them. And it's a really helpful way of trying to meet a person where they're at. Our knee-jerk reaction, I guess, when we see pain is to try and fix it. So it's really reinforcing that concept. We really want families to recognise that the strength for change can often rest within the individual themselves. So talking about drawing out, and that's where we have conversations around change talk, encouraging families to seek their loved ones' sense of the issue at the moment. Do they see it as a problem? Because often, we're both at different pages of the book, if you like, that they may well not see this as a problem. They may see this as very functional, and understanding and being curious about that is a really helpful place to start for families. But if they are thinking about change, then starting to get their reasons for change, not us giving them reasons for change. So really being more curious and inquisitive can help to invite their loved ones to be more contemplative about change. And acceptance, which is, difficult sometimes when there's ambivalence and when there's risk to accept their autonomy, their right to choose, maintaining a sense of acceptance and of their worth as individuals too, because sometimes this can be really frustrating for families. So it's a really good framework, I think, to educate families around the spirit of what motivational interviewing is about. So in terms of what families are up against, and I think this is really important, that there's a real tension in this relationship. The families feel quite torn between the hopes that they have for their loved ones and the fear of the behaviours that they're engaging in, and normalising the writing reflex, or now motivational interviewing calls it the fixing reflex. Just understand that that's, as I said before, comes from a good place. You care about your loved one, you want to help, and we just want you to acknowledge that. Pause, slow down your thinking, think about how you might be able to invite that kind of conversation without forcing that conversation. It can be really helpful. In the group last night, one of the mums was talking about feeling a sense of relief. Her son has chosen, because she's put in a boundary, no drug use in the house. His behaviour is unacceptable when he's drug using. And she said, he calls her some pretty awful names when he's under the influence. And she said, she's put up with this for years, but for whatever reason now, she just said, I actually don't deserve to be spoken to like that. So she's kind of put in a couple of boundaries around that. And he's kind of cracked it and taken off. And then, 10 minutes later after leaving the house, he rang her up for money, wanting fuel for the car, and all those sort of things. And she just said, it's just such a tension when you try to put in a boundary, the fear of what will happen. And that's really hard. And we never direct families. We use motivational interviewing in the conversations we have with families very much for that same reason, to just help guide them, help them to be reflective, to help them to think about all the pros and the cons of what their decision making is, not force them to make a particular choice. And I think that's really helpful for us when working with families, to always be staying in that spirit of motivational interviewing as well. I already said before about how families often feel excluded from treatment, and a recognition that families don't necessarily need fixing. They need space to be heard and validated, and as I said before, being invited along this journey, and to be part of it. So, yeah. How we going for time? Yep, not too bad. So for me, and I kind of like this slide. It's not my slide. I can't remember where I think I got it from the Motivational Interviewing for Loved Ones, Milo. MI shifts the conversations from control to connection. I just think, isn't that what it's all about? It's such a nice way to be thinking about these relationships. Moving from fear to reflection, we teach or invite families to think a lot more about using reflective statements rather than corrective statements. So, when a loved one expresses a frustration or whatever it might be, to just use a reflection to show that validation, that connection. It may encourage them to elaborate even more on what they're talking about. So, that's a really helpful way to kind of sit in that space, and moving away from advice to collaboration. So the mini model of kind of listen, reflect, affirm, ask permission, and offer perspective. Invitation to Change talks about the information sandwich. And it's probably a modification of the elicit, provide, elicit, or ask, offer, ask concept within motivational interviewing. So it's just nice to see what a person knows about the thing, offer, if they're interested, some of your own thoughts. One of the mums was talking about wanting to get their loved one into smart recovery, and she sort of shared with the group, oh, should I just send them an email with a link to smart recovery meetings? And the group's kind of tossed that around a little bit and decided that it's better to just have that conversation of seeing if she's interested. And one of the things that has been a really constant theme for our groups is from the families is just that feeling of connection. And we say, you don't have to, but it's not a bad idea to let people know that this is tough, and I get support from a group of people that kind of understand what I'm in, and that may be of interest to you. Not saying you should or shouldn't do that. And so we kind of like to encourage families to think of themselves as being role models for self-care in that space. Anyway, ORS, I'm sure you've all know about the open-ended questions, affirmations, reflections, and summaries. We kind of do that probably really with the open-ended questions. We talk a lot about being curious. Just trying to be curious is a great way for families to connect, and give them, explain what an open-ended question is, obviously, versus closed questions, and how it invites more of a response. And sometimes that can be difficult to answer. Like my mum asked her loved one what she likes about juice, and she said she couldn't really answer it at that point. And I said, well, that's okay. You just leave it there. Don't keep pushing. You may come back to that conversation another time. Affirmations really encourage people to think about strengths and to recognize that, because sometimes families get so consumed by the fear and worry of the behavior they don't want to see and put so much attention on that, they forget about some of the other wonderful things that their loved ones are doing. So, and we encourage them to think about affirming those kind of strengths. And, even as in the young woman I was talking about earlier with the alcohol and the Wernicke's and then the sort of severe peripheral neuropathy. One quality about her is she's a strong, determined woman. And mum could kind of see that and notice that even despite all these adverse outcomes from alcohol, she's still determined to get a job and still determined. So there's some wonderful things to affirm in that person as well. And reflections, I think, are a great tool to validate. As I said, they're just acknowledging you've heard the person correctly. You've really the Thomas Gordon sort of stuff. To make sure that what you think you've heard is exactly what they meant, and do that through reflections. And obviously, you can really deepen your understanding of where they're sitting at. So they're really nice tools to educate families around. And obviously, it's all about a particular target behavior. So if you think about the four processes of motivational interviewing, engagement, we have engagement because we're connected through being into a partner relationship or being a parent or being a sibling. You've already got a level of engagement, but this is kind of different when we're talking about engagement around these kind of issues, and that so that often talk about for a person to really talk openly and honestly about their feelings and their thoughts is takes a lot of vulnerability. So it's really important for us to create that space of safety, and we can do that through motivational interviewing. So yeah, just like to remind people about that. And then if you do get an area of concern with your loved one, to then start to invite or explore more of their reasons why. So the evoking kind of stuff. And we talk about using things like importance confidence rules can be really helpful. Things like it's a common saying within addiction treatment, play the tape forward. It's getting people to think about where to from here. If I keep doing this, where will I be in a year's time, 5 years' time? All those things are just interesting kind of tools. So we share some of those evocative questioning techniques that we have in motivational interviewing, and it helps families just to have different conversations. So, and obviously, if they do decide that they want to make a change, then it's coming along and sharing in the planning for that change, what that might look like for them. Um, so these are some of the comments that we've had from the groups, slightly edited, but I thought I had to be tough love or nothing. And again, that's those messages that we hear in the community about responding, and you sort of see things with politicians being tough on crime, and and we kind of know how ineffective that response has been worldwide. So reminding them that they don't have to be tough love or nothing. Connection is so much important, and you've all probably heard of Johann Hari's kind of the opposite of addiction is not abstinence, it's connection, and it's so important. Learning motivational interviewing techniques gave me another way to love my daughter without losing myself. So just gave her a different kind of conversation. We just did a trial group in partnership with the local mental health service for some loved ones with all bar one were adult children. And that was one of the things that they immediately almost got from the get-go. Once they realized they could let go of some of these unhelpful things, one person was really passive and was just so frustrated that because he couldn't have more helpful conversations with a loved one, another parent was trying to really control. Once they were able to let go of those things, have permission to let go of those things, they just found they had much better conversations, which was really nice to hear. I stopped trying to fix him. I started listening, and it changed everything. So just that connection, and yeah, as I said before, when you create the space for those kind of conversations by, we talk about the pause button, slowing down our reactions. One mum last week was talking about the phone goes off. It's her son. She takes a deep breath. She doesn't answer it immediately. She actually pauses, thinks about what she wants to say, and then she picks up the phone. Another one, I feel like I understand more about why, and that comes from that kind of curious questioning, not trying to fix it or solve it, and being okay to hear it. That's not easy. And being in a group helped me realize that I was not the only one. And hearing how others use the tools helps, although I don't always act the way I would like. And that's a common scenario. Behavior change is difficult for all of us. So, it's difficult for families to try and approach this in a different way. And as I said before, with that example of the mum feeling clunky and her daughter calling her a therapist, it's just okay to acknowledge that I'm just trying something different because I care. So it is about shifting as helping professionals, shifting our focus too, from fixing families, from often blaming families. So I'm kind of been around for a little while and started in the institutions, and I remember learning about the theory of the schizophrenogenic mother. So we were blaming families from the get-go in mental health around this sort of stuff, and I think we do that in addiction as well. Tend to look for that sort of stuff, which is really unhelpful, and excluding them. So we're moving away from that to supporting and expecting and accepting that families are going to be ambivalent about this stuff. This is not easy for them too. So some families have been in that righting reflex for a long time, and that's hard for them to step back from that. And that there can be ambivalence. And so we talk about that and just explore that as we would any behavior change. Giving them the tools to help different conversations, and really acknowledging and valuing their role, I think, are really helpful ways for us as families. And just encourage you to think about that in your own practice. you know, to maybe come away from today, hopefully thinking a little bit more about how can we centre families in our work. Think about, who you might want to do this with. I like the saying, who needs your listening most? And it may not be the client at that point because they're sort of really in a different phase of change, but the family may be really keen to start to learn new things. And so some of the books, these are not all of the things that I found really helpful. Obviously, learning motivational interviewing is really helpful and important. I think it's good to, you can't really go past the guidebook, if you like, and the fourth edition. And one of the things I like about motivational interviewing, it has continued to reflect on itself and make modifications. So, I started back with the first edition and now we're up to a fourth edition. I like Bill Miller's Listening Well, The Art of Empathic Understanding, and I share that book with families. More recently, I've become involved in Invitation to Change, and that's from the Centre for Motivation and Change, and they have the book Beyond Addiction, How Science and Kindness Help People Change. I've done the Smart Family and Friends Facilitator course, which is really focused on the five-step model. So of Richard Vallerman, which is the sort of stress, strain, and coping. They're all really useful. And what I like about all of those models is that they are evidence-based. They're coming and really reflecting on their on themselves and seeking to improve. The ITC, one of the things I do like is the kind of 8-point model, letting families know behaviours make sense. So let's understand the behaviour. No one's going to continue doing something that they don't get some functional benefit from. So understanding that one size doesn't fit all when it comes to treatment processes. So really being accepting that, there may be a harm reduction model, might be the suitable model right through to a residential treatment model. Ambivalence is normal. Learning good communication tools is very helpful for families. Learning behaviour tools, so Invitation to Change and Craft are really focused on incentivising positive change. I like the metaphor that, tough love is kind of like if you've got a garden that you're growing a veggie garden, say, or flowers or whatever, and tough love is a bit like using Roundup to kill the weeds. It just obliterates everything. That's what tough love just shuts down all connection. Where if we take a nurturing approach to the plants we want to, so we give the vegetables or the flowers that we want more nutrient, more water, more attention, and don't give anything to the weeds die off. And so it's a nice metaphor to think about what we're trying to do with these skills is to really nurture the behaviors we want to see in our loved ones and reinforce them positively, but don't get heavy on the stuff we don't want to see because that just creates more conflict. Just don't give it energy, really. Self-awareness, understanding ourselves and being really, that's so important. The willingness, because, takes a lot of willingness. There's, both sides to this kind of coin and important. And self-compassion is another really important one. Now, this metaphor I just quickly want to share before I log off, come out of a conversation in a WhatsApp group that we've been a part of. And we kind of come up with this flying a kite as a metaphor for loved ones. Supporting a loved one through change is like flying a kite. You hold the string, offering steady connection, but you can't control the wind. Sometimes the kite soars high, sometimes it dives, sometimes it feels like it's lost altogether. Your job isn't to force it to fly the way you want. It's to be present, holding the line lightly but firmly, offering safety and connection, no matter what the winds bring. You can adjust, you can respond, but you can't change the wind, and you don't have to let go of yourself to stay connected. So they kind of like that as a metaphor, and I think it's a nice one to think about what we're trying to do. And as I said before, connection is just so important. So we need to give families permission to be connected and tools to do that in a helpful way. But yeah, so over to you, James.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mark. And I know you probably wouldn't have been able to be monitoring the chat, but there's certainly been a lot of very reflective comments and appreciation for what you've taken us through in just that very short period of time this morning. And there's also some nice comments and questions if it's okay to share with you. And thanks for popping your details up there as well. That's really kind. Yeah, and you did very well in the asynchronous
Yeah,
Well,
it's
it's
weird to
kind of
talking,
seem.
not to see faces or anything. It's a strange environment.
I almost turned my camera on, but you probably don't need to see that. But anyway, here we are now. Look, love some of the, just a couple of things that you said there, Mark, before because we have time for questions, which is awesome. You mentioned some really kind of like key things I think that really resonated for me. The importance of family to recovery. I think we know that, but sometimes it's really good to have that reinforced, as well as just yeah. I'm eyes wide open for me now a little bit more. They're often ready sooner. I probably know that, but never really kind of had it conceptualized into words and a statement to kind of realize, yeah, well, often, that responsiveness and tailoring services to support families is going to do a whole lot because they're often the ones, maybe even potentially, more ready in an earlier point. So that was an incredibly important, I think, point to be making. And yeah, are some really key things that you spoke about. And I know myself, and certainly in providing training around motivational interviewing, you're often working with clinicians around the fixing reflex. And I guess today's just helped me to reflect as well about how that must be dialed up tenfold for families. In a way. And, some of those sticky messages that are still out there about tough love and rock bottom, they've really stuck, haven't they? Um,
Unfortunately. And they came from an earlier time when we didn't have the science that we have now. So when you think about Al-Anon and AA, they were good in their time. And I think it's just great now that we've got a little bit more science and evidence around what works and what doesn't. So yeah, I'm certainly not against it in the sense, but it's just not helpful.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah. Look, I'll go to some of the questions that came up. You mentioned Oars, Milo, Meso. Um, and the question is around which of those do you feel like works best for families or that they most relate to and maybe if, and connect with. Um, I suppose it's different strokes for different folks. But as you're talking about that, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about Milo and Meso as you're kind of maybe unpacking that.
yeah, well, so Milo, I guess, as I said, my background's been in the motivational interviewing world, and I come across this concept of it was actually I was seeking something. A way I could teach motivational interviewing, and so I went sort of scanning the net and the Mint Oceania and Mint network were really great in being able to pose these kind of questions. And someone responded back with Milo and Dr. Emily Klein, and so I went and had a bit of a deeper dive into that, and it just helped give me a bit of a framework. We're obviously not wanting to teach people to be therapists as such. We just want to give them some really helpful tools and techniques that sit within motivational interviewing that are helpful. And that's what I got from the Milo model. And I think you're going to put in the resources, James, about that, how to have difficult conversations. I think it was called. I can't, the Boston model of bringing in, which I think is what it really is about, just giving families ways to have these kind of difficult conversations and teaching families around approaching things from a curious framework really takes the steam out of the confrontation that can sometimes happen. So whenever there's any kind of anger and stuff, just to be curious about that seems to really genuinely curious, not seems to take the steam out of it because the person's no longer got something to push against. It's kind of like, tell me more about that. It's kind of like, well, I can't keep raising my voice. You're actually wanting to listen to me, and it sort of changes the dynamic a little bit. So I feel that's really helpful.
Yeah, and any of the things that you find that families particularly really connect with from the MI skill set or some of these frameworks that have, infused by MI, like Milo, and I have popped the link in the chat to the Boston Medical Center, which I believe is the founder, Dr. Emily Klein. There's free training that they have. I've not done it, but it seems to be well kind of like endorsed. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. The things I guess that definitely being validated for a start is one of the things families find most helpful, and being acknowledged for that this is a tough journey and that once you start talking about that writing reflex, they all can relate to that, and then that creates a willingness or a desire to, well, what else is there? If I don't do this, what else is there? And that's when you can, so in a sense, you're creating an opportunity for them to be curious about, well, what else is out there? This is all I know. And you sort of start to show those things. And as I said before, when I always talk about those resources in the Beyond Addiction and the Craft How to Get Your Loved One Sober kind of books, the Smart Family and Friends manuals. But that craft one, when you talk about how to get your loved one sober, an alternative to nagging, pleading, or threatening, it just hooks people in because they just can relate to that's what I've been doing. And I didn't know there was another way. And nobody shares this stuff with me. Where do I find this stuff too? That's another challenge. And I noticed there was one comment there about what would you like to see different in the service system? And this goes right back to my mental health days. You know, we should have a funding allocation for family engagement, for the family inclusive approach, so that if you're seeing a family member, that should be a different kind of a stat in your KPIs, if you like, where it's not counted um, in the systems that I've worked in the past for that recognition. It does take a bit different work. Sometimes it can be a little bit more complicated. Sometimes it can be really straightforward. Sometimes it takes a lot more time. And I just think I would like to think that we actually incentivize the kind of behaviors we want to see in the workforce too, and so putting things like different ways of measuring family inclusion is useful. And I'm a big fan of trying to be all under the one roof. I really, the kind of fractured systems that we have, there was a great conversation many years ago. The title of the presentation was, Are Clients Getting More Complex, or is the system getting more complex? And I think the system has become incredibly complex. There's so many different ways to get your support, and it becomes, we need navigators to help people navigate the journey. And that in itself, I think, highlights the complexity we've created within the system. And I would love to see some more streamlining and more, one-stop kind of approach. And that goes back to my background in dual diagnosis too. I really like to think about integrated services.
Mm. No, I kind of agree with you there. Once we need navigators, the system is broken.
Yep.
So, sorry, just personal reflection. Speaking of reflections, there are a few more questions here, Mark, if you've got the time, and we do have
Yep.
time before 11. But there's also some really awesome reflections which we'll share with you as well through feedback. But there's one here. Problematic substance use and mental health challenges have been part of my life for over 30 years as a sister, friend, daughter, mother, patient, and as a professional in the field. This education and information is exceptional and so very accurate. The journey of a loved one is confusing, complicated, and unfamiliar, and your group program and education undoubtedly helps people when they're drowning in the uncertainty, chaos, and fear. Great work, Mark. I see such value in what you're doing.
Absolutely. And, it really warms my heart to do what I do. And, we do this out of hours, and that's exactly why we do it. It's great.
Mm.
Thank you.
Yeah, and there's many others of those, but coming back to some of the questions, from your experience, what are some of the challenges that you find families have moving from fixing to listening, and how might you support them through that?
Yeah, and this is where I think we have to be comfortable with ambivalence. And so we have one family member who is very aware that, she still jumps in there, she still does the fixing, and it's okay. We hold that space and just accept where she's at. Others are more willing to think, yeah, I want to try different things. And so we kind of really just sit on that continuum with people, really. But yeah, I don't know whether I answered the question now, James. Can you say it again?
Sure, sure. Just about the challenges you've seen for families moving from fixing to listening, and any advice you'd have around helping people on that journey.
Yeah, to me, it is a lot about just explaining what we've been talking about. We do explain the stages of change model. I think that's really helpful for people and
Mm.
to understand that process of change. And so that helps them, I guess, understand where they can fit in there. I really like the work in invitation to change, that incentivizing the behavior you want to see. So that metaphor around the garden and the tough love and, roundup really seems to resonate well. So there, yeah.
And I like the way that you just said before around helping families understand things like ambivalence as well, and that as you and many of our listeners to this morning know, MI allows us to allows both sides to breathe and have life. It's going to obviously want to help to promote and evoke and strengthen as you said, the darn cats, the stuff about what the person wants to be different, but to be able to sit with both is important, and to hear both and not shut one side down, because it just tends to pop the other side back up again.
Yeah,
So,
very much
yeah,
so. Yeah, that's a good metaphor. Yeah.
yeah, no, well done, thank you. This is a question, I guess, and I know that WRAD Health has a number of different programs. And the Smart Recovery Families program is obviously families that they put their hand up to come along to treatment. This is where maybe it is that you're working with a person, in this case, particularly a young person, when they don't want to have their family included as part of the journey. Do you have any advice for clinicians or workers around, navigating that, particularly where there's value seen in getting the support from those that are part of the natural support system?
Yeah, look, I guess, and probably seen that. Well, no, in both sectors, both mental health and ARD, I've seen that a bit. I I do think you need obviously a separate therapist or counselor for that process, so that there is that individuality. If a person would like their family to be seen together, I embrace that. I also recognise that sometimes they need individual work. When it comes to things like education, we can't talk about specifics of a person's condition. So it's more about these are tools to support a family without necessarily saying your loved one has schizophrenia or whatever. If they're really reluctant to that, it's just about teaching them family support. And I think I really love the growth that we have in the lived and living experience workforce now. And I think, our service, we don't have funding for such roles, but I really think they have a really unique place in that space, so that they're not coming from a clinical kind of perspective, and they can just connect with that person. I think that gives an avenue for engagement in a different way. And, hopefully over time, we're creating a culture in our workforce, and I think we're seeing it here at RAD now, where people are at least offering family support. So, again, being respectful that not everyone wants it, and we just acknowledge that, and that's where it stays. But yeah, and that's where, like, the groups we run are out of hours. People just access off the internet, the Smart Recovery site, so it's not prescriptive, and so there's kind of less fear or specificity, I suppose, that it's directly related to their loved one, if that makes sense.
So
And
using
just
some of those linkages with other services for the family can strengthen the system, I guess, even if you can't do it directly.
yeah, absolutely. And just on that, post-COVID, we have families come from England, from Ireland. In the past, had families come from New Zealand, and we do get a lot of families from Queensland and New South Wales. So I think whatever you're doing in those two states is great in terms of people being aware that smart recovery and smart family and friends groups exist, because we seem to get more people from there than we do in our own backyard. But
Okay, right. Well, thank you for sharing widely these services. It's good to know. There might be a few more after today inquiries. I guess just we've got time maybe just for a last question here. Sorry, I'm just going back through to see if I've covered everything. It's mainly around, and this may be a little bit kind of wider than the topic of, sharing with families how role modeling MI skills to families to then use those skills with their loved ones to help maintain those connections and the curious stance and bring the spirit. When the fam and this when you're working with families maybe who are also using substances, in family work, is that something that you've come across, or any kind of like practice tips around that? Questions come up a few times.
That's a good question, and it hasn't been most families that come along that have their lived experience is a past lived experience, so it's not been a current one, and so I can't really comment on what the level of family engagement with someone who's in active use themselves. I think one of the things, and I know it's a little bit off topic, but we've been really advocating for residential rehab down here in our area for the reasons that we can work with the family support system and our work with First Nations, that we've certainly seen some of those kind of issues. And I'm excited to see where that would take us, but at this stage, I probably can't give you a good answer on that one.
Sure. No, thank you. Thanks for considering it. Look, that's taken us to time for 11 o'clock. And hopefully everyone has received that link for the Motivation Interviewing for Loved Ones training package. If you do undertake it, we'd love to hear here at Insight around any sort of assistance that is, or your views on it, because it might be something that we could promote more widely to help build those skills. It's not like a family member has to be a fully minted or motivational interviewing network trainer, hey Mark, but it's more around some of those, weaving in some of those skills to be able to create a different feel to some of these conversations. And these connections and relationships. Mark, you've been very generous today to come to us all the way from Victoria to present and to share some of your, practice experience and also your kind of the journey that you've had with motivational and interviewing. So thank you very much on behalf of Inside APSAD community, learners from across Australia. And we do get a lot of people from Victoria who attend these as well. So it's nice that there's a little bit of community sharing around all these things. So thank you. Really appreciate that. And for anyone who's leaving the webinar, you'll see a survey pop up where you can give some feedback. And yeah, some of those nice reflections that have been popped in the chat, I think it would be lovely to be able to pass those on to Mark as part of kind of a collation of that feedback. For many of you who are familiar with our Inside APSAB webinar series, we have another session occurring next Wednesday. That's Dr. Gabrielle Campbell from University of Queensland, who's talking on improving youth alcohol and other drug treatment outcomes, looking at clinical profiles and engagement trends. So that'll be at 10 o'clock here in Queensland time, and you're all welcome to join us. So once again, thank you very much, Mark. We'll be in contact, but really much appreciate your time with us this morning and also for everyone who has joined us.